The saloon went dead quiet the moment Monroe Wallace's voice dropped to that low, dangerous register that made grown men check the distance to the door. "Say her name wrong one more time," he said, and every syllable landed like a boot heel on hardwood, deliberate and heavy. "And see what happens." Clyde Barton stood in the middle of the Dusty Creek saloon with a whiskey glass halfway to his lips and a grin frozen on his face that no longer reached his eyes. He was Rattlesnake Ridge's most celebrated purveyor of gossip, a man whose tongue had ruined 3 marriages, 2 business partnerships, and 1 perfectly decent poker night, and he was accustomed to being the most dangerous mouth in any given room. But Monroe Wallace was not most men, and the look in those steel-gray eyes was not the look of a man making idle conversation. Barton had been holding court at the bar for the better part of an hour, telling anyone who would listen about the new schoolteacher who had arrived on the noon stage 3 days ago. He had said it twice already, loud enough for the whole room to hear, twisting the woman's name into something diminutive and mocking, clipping the vowels and curling his lip as though the name itself tasted of something he found beneath him. "That Fletcher woman," he'd said the first time. "That Alice Fletcher," he'd said the second time, deliberately mangling it. Now Monroe was across the room with his jaw set like iron, and Clyde Barton was beginning to understand that the third time might cost him something he couldn't get back. "I don't know what your interest is in the school, marm," Barton started, his voice still carrying that practiced lightness of a man accustomed to talking his way through any corner. Monroe crossed the last 4 feet of space between them in 2 strides, and the glass in Barton's hand clinked hard against the bar when the man involuntarily stepped backward. "Her name," Monroe said quietly, almost gently, which somehow made it worse, "is Alice Fletcher. You will say it correctly, or you will not say it at all." The bartender, a thick-armed man named Gus who had seen everything this town had to offer in 20 years behind the counter, found something urgent to do at the far end of the bar. No one in the room spoke. Clyde Barton looked into Monroe Wallace's face and saw something there that settled it decisively. He set his glass down. He straightened his vest. He said, very carefully and very correctly, "Alice Fletcher," and then he picked up his hat and walked out of the saloon with what dignity he could carry, which was not much. The room exhaled. And Monroe Wallace stood there for a moment longer, something working in his jaw, something he hadn't expected working in the region of his chest, before he turned and walked back out into the afternoon glare of a New Mexico summer, into a story that had begun, as all the most consequential ones do, long before either of them had any idea how it would end. It was the summer of 1884, and Rattlesnake Ridge, New Mexico territory, was the kind of town that existed in the particular limbo between the lawless frontier it had been and the civilized settlement it was trying to become. The cattle trade kept it breathing. The railroad, which had arrived 3 years prior at the nearest junction 12 miles south, had brought general commerce and a degree of ambition to the place that had not existed before. There was a post office now, a proper one with an actual postmaster, and a school that had gone without a permanent teacher for the better part of 2 years, rotating through a string of reluctant temporary appointments from men who invariably left after one encounter with the Hargrove boys in the back row. The town needed a teacher badly enough that the school board had written to a placement agency in St. Louis, and the placement agency had eventually produced Alice Fletcher, 26 years old, recently certified, possessed of an unreasonable degree of courage for a woman who had spent her entire life within 15 miles of the Mississippi River. Alice had arrived on a Tuesday in June with 2 large trunks, a smaller bag of books, a letter of appointment that she had read so many times the creases were wearing thin, and absolutely no preparation for what greeted her at the stage stop in Rattlesnake Ridge. What greeted her was heat like a physical wall, dust that tasted of alkali, a main street that was technically mud from a recent rain but drying rapidly back into iron-hard ruts, and Clyde Barton, who had an almost supernatural instinct for the arrival of anyone new and interesting, and had positioned himself at the stage office to watch her climb down. She had managed the descent with her usual composure, brushed the travel dust from her green traveling dress with quick, efficient movements, and looked around at Rattlesnake Ridge with an expression that said she was cataloging it carefully and reserving judgment. "You'll be the new teacher," Barton had said, appearing at her elbow with the particular sociability of a man who considers all information his personal property. "I am," she said, "Alice Fletcher, and you are Clyde Barton. I know everyone in this town and everything about them." He had said it pleasantly, as though it were a service he was providing rather than a warning. "How useful," Alice said, and turned to see about her trunks, which was the correct response and which Barton remembered for the rest of the day with a mixture of irritation and admiration. She had been installed in the small house adjacent to the schoolhouse, a two-room affair that was nonetheless more space than she'd had at the boarding house in St. Louis, and she had spent her first 2 days organizing her classroom with the focused intensity of someone building a fortress. Desks were aligned. Books were arranged by subject, and then alphabetically within subject. The chalkboard was clean to a brightness that the building had probably never seen in its existence. A map of the United States, current as of 1882, was pinned to the wall with the territories clearly marked, and Alice had stood back and looked at all of it with a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with anyone else's opinion of it. Monroe Wallace had not been looking for a reason to notice Alice Fletcher. Monroe Wallace, at 34 years old, had what most people in Rattlesnake Ridge would have described as a settled life, which was their polite way of saying a life that had calcified around the edges in ways that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. He ran the Wallace Ranch, 6,000 acres of decent grazing land with a solid herd of longhorn cattle, and a reputation for fair dealing that was worth considerably more than money in that part of the territory. He had a foreman named Pete Dawson, who he trusted completely, a crew of 12 men he trusted adequately, and a house that was well built and almost entirely empty of anything that could be called warmth. He had been married once, 7 years ago, to a woman named Clara, who had come west with him from Texas with the best intentions, and had lasted 3 years before the isolation and the relentlessness of ranch life had worn her down to something neither of them recognized. The divorce had been quiet and without particular drama, and Clara had gone back to her family in San Antonio, and Monroe had gone back to working 14-hour days, which was what he knew how to do. There was no bitterness in him about it, which was perhaps the saddest part. He had simply closed that door and not thought much about what it meant that he had closed it so easily. He had heard about the new schoolteacher in the way he heard about most things that happened in town, which was incidentally, and after the fact, because Monroe Wallace did not involve himself in the social machinery of Rattlesnake Ridge, unless absolutely compelled to. He had business at the general store on the Thursday after her arrival, and it was there, quite simply, that he first saw her. She was at the counter with a list in her hand, speaking to old Frank Dutton with a directness that Frank clearly found surprising and refreshing in equal measure. She was asking about the quality of the ink available, and whether the chalk could be ordered in larger quantities, and if the supply wagon from Albuquerque could be counted on to deliver reliably. "I have 22 students expected in September," she was saying, "and I intend to be adequately supplied before they arrive, not scrambling afterward." Frank, who was accustomed to wives and housekeepers making their purchases with a degree of social deference to his expertise on everything, looked slightly dazzled. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I'll see what I can do." Monroe had been waiting for Frank to finish with a customer before he attended to his own business, and he had watched this exchange with the involuntary attention of a man who does not expect to be interested in something, but finds that he is. She was not what he would have predicted from the description, schoolteacher. She was not timid, for one thing. She was not performing a kind of careful smallness that women in difficult social positions sometimes adopted as protection. She stood at that counter and engaged Frank Dutton as an equal, which in 1884 in the New Mexico Territory was a thing requiring either considerable courage or the particular confidence of someone who had simply never learned to be otherwise. He had left without speaking to her, which he did not examine as a decision at the time. He had his supplies, she had hers, and the transaction of daily life moved on. It was the following week, on a Wednesday, that the thing with Clyde Barton had occurred, and the thing with Monroe's response to it had surprised him considerably more than it seemed to have surprised anyone else in the room. He had been at the saloon for reasons he could justify, which was a bill of sale he needed witnessed, and Gus kept a notary stamp behind the counter. Barton had been in the middle of his performance, that theatrical gossip that was part theater and part damage, and Monroe had heard the name mangled twice and felt something he couldn't quite name pull tight in his chest. And then Barton had done it a third time with an extra curl of contempt, and Monroe had crossed the room before he consciously decided to move. He stood in the afternoon heat outside the saloon afterward and tried to account for what had just happened, which was this. He had threatened a man over a woman he had exchanged 0 words with, for reasons he could not entirely articulate, which was not consistent with any version of himself he recognized. Pete Dawson, who had been outside with the horses and had heard enough through the saloon's thin walls, looked at him with the carefully neutral expression of a man who has known his employer for 12 years and is choosing his moment. "Don't," Monroe said. "Wasn't going to say anything," Pete said. "Good." They rode back to the ranch in a silence that Pete filled, eventually and inevitably, by saying, "When's the last time you did anything that surprised you?" Monroe didn't answer, which Pete correctly read as the answer. Alice had heard about the incident in the saloon before nightfall of that same day, because in Rattlesnake Ridge information traveled at a velocity that made the telegraph seem leisurely. It was Mrs. Hobbs, the preacher's wife, who told her, appearing at the schoolhouse door with a jar of preserved peaches that was clearly a pretext, and launching immediately into the account with an enthusiasm she was making only modest attempts to conceal. "Monroe Wallace, Mrs. Hobbs said, as though the name itself were the headline, stood up right in the middle of the saloon and told Clyde Barton to say your name properly or not at all. Alice looked up from the reading primer she was reviewing and felt something move through her that she catalogued carefully before she let herself feel it fully. Surprise, warmth, and underneath both of those, a kind of wariness, because she was 26 years old and had been managing the consequences of other people's notions about her for most of her life, and a man defending her name in a saloon could mean something worth feeling good about, or it could mean something that would come to her door wanting repayment, and she had learned the hard way that the difference mattered enormously. "Did he?" Alice said. "He did," Mrs. Hobbs confirmed. And Clyde Barton walked out of there like a man with a lit match in his pocket. Alice considered this. "He said my name correctly before he left." "He did, very carefully." "Then I suppose the outcome was correct," Alice said. "Whatever the method." She turned back to her primer, and Mrs. Hobbs, who had expected rather more in the way of romantic exclamation, left the peaches and departed with a thoughtful expression. Alice did feel something. She would have been dishonest to deny it, and she was, above all things, honest with herself. She felt the specific warmth of having been protected without being made helpless, which was a distinction she cared about deeply. She felt curious about the man who had made that distinction by instinct, if instinct it was. And she felt, underneath everything, the familiar caution of someone who had been in a town for 1 week, and was not in a position to afford complications. She met Monroe Wallace properly on a Friday afternoon at the end of that same week. She had been walking back from the post office with a letter from her mother in St. Louis, and he had been coming out of the land registry office with a rolled document under his arm, and they had nearly collided at the corner of Main and 2nd, because she had been reading the envelope's return address and not watching where she was going. He had stepped aside with a reflexive courtesy that was practiced and genuine at once, the way manners are when they are actually internalized rather than performed. And she had looked up and seen him clearly for the first time, and he had looked down and seen her. And for one brief moment both of them simply stood there in the afternoon light, while the moment organized itself into something. He was taller than she had expected from Mrs. Hobbs's description, which had focused primarily on his jaw and his eyes. He was broad-shouldered in the way of men who have done physical work their entire lives, with hands that showed it and a face that showed it too, weathered and direct and not, she noticed, unkind. The gray eyes she had heard described were in fact very gray, the color of a morning sky before the sun decides what it's going to do with the day. "Miss Fletcher," he said, correctly and without hesitation. "Mr. Wallace," she said, and saw something minute shift in his expression that might have been relief or might have been acknowledgement that she knew who he was and therefore knew what he had done, and had chosen to open with his name rather than a reference to it, which was its own kind of statement. "You're settling in all right?" he asked. It was the obvious question, the expected question, but he asked it with an attention that made it feel like he actually wanted the answer. "I am," she said. "The schoolhouse is well positioned, and the house is more comfortable than I anticipated. I have 2 months before school begins, which is exactly enough time to do everything properly if I don't waste any of it." "That sounds like a plan," he said. "It is a plan," she said. He looked at her for a moment in which she had the impression he was deciding something, and then he said, "If you need anything the town hasn't provided, let Frank Dutton know. He'll add it to our ranch order and I can bring it by when we come in. We make the run twice a month." She held the offer in her mind for exactly the right amount of time, neither too quick to refuse as though it were an imposition nor too quick to accept as though she required it. "That's practical," she said. "Thank you," he nodded. He did not linger. He went back to his horse, mounted with the ease of a man who has done it 10,000 times, and rode toward the edge of town, and Alice Fletcher stood at the corner of Main and 2nd in the June heat and watched him go and then looked at her mother's letter and made herself think about that instead. Her mother's letter, as it turned out, was exactly what she had expected. Her mother had concerns. Her mother expressed these concerns with the particular sophistication of a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of making her opinions sound like loving questions. Was it not very far away? Was it not quite dangerous? Were there not other positions available, closer? And at the end, tucked like a postscript but clearly the whole point, had Alice thought again about Mr. Carver, who was still available and who had a very good position at the bank, and who, more than anything else, represented the specific variety of settled future that her mother could relax into. Alice folded the letter back into its envelope and dropped it into the pocket of her skirt and walked home in the slanting late afternoon light, thinking about the specific mechanics of a life chosen on someone else's terms, which was something she thought about regularly, because it was something she had decided at 23, after a period of genuine deliberation, that she would not do. She had refused Mr. Carver 18 months ago with more grace than she felt. She had taken the certification course seriously, and then the placement seriously, and the appointment seriously, and she was here in Rattlesnake Ridge, New Mexico territory, with a classroom to prepare and 22 students coming in September, and absolutely no plan to have anyone's life be more important than the one she was building. She was also, if she was being completely honest with herself, still thinking about gray eyes that paid actual attention. July in Rattlesnake Ridge arrived with the particular ferocity of a desert summer that has been gathering its forces for months. The heat was immense and specific, the kind that radiates up from the earth as much as it descends from the sky, and Alice adapted to it with the methodical practicality that was her primary personal resource. She rose earlier. She did her outdoor errands before 8 in the morning. She kept the schoolhouse shuttered on its western side during the afternoons and discovered that this created a cross-draft from the eastern windows that made the temperature bearable if not pleasant. She also began to know the town, and the town began to know her, in the gradual and particular way of a community deciding what to make of a newcomer who is not performing the expected part. She knew Mrs. Hobbs, who was kind and relentlessly curious. She knew Frank Dutton, who had decided she was the most organized person he had encountered in 30 years of running a general store, and was treating this as both a compliment and a slight challenge to his professional dignity. She knew Judge Harlan, who sat on the school board and who had welcomed her with a formality that was genuine and a relief, given that the other two board members had spent their welcome speech explaining to her what the previous teachers had done wrong in ways that made very clear they expected her to repeat it. She knew Clyde Barton, whom she encountered twice in the weeks following the saloon incident, and she handled him with a precision that she had clearly thought through. The first time, she greeted him by name, correctly, and asked after his health with a directness that left him with nothing to gossip about. The second time, she was in a conversation with Mrs. Davies at the dry goods store when Barton arrived, and she simply continued the conversation at its natural pace, without acknowledging the pointed way he paused near them, waiting for an invitation into the discussion that did not come. Word of both encounters circulated through town with the usual speed, and the general consensus was that the new schoolteacher was, quote, not someone to be trifled with, which was the highest compliment available in the local vocabulary. Monroe Wallace came to town on the 15th of July with Pete and two of the ranch hands and the ranch wagon for the supply run, and he stopped at the school supply office to drop off a package that Frank Dutton had been holding, a set of arithmetic textbooks that Alice had ordered from a publisher in Philadelphia, and which had arrived addressed to the general store, because she had not yet established a reliable delivery arrangement of her own. He knocked on the schoolhouse door with the parcel under his arm and waited, and Alice opened the door and looked at the parcel and then at him and said, "Those are the arithmetic books. Come in." He came in and set the books on the desk she indicated, and she was already opening the paper wrapping with efficient hands, checking the titles against a list she produced from the top desk drawer, and he stood in the middle of her classroom and looked at what she had made of it. It was remarkable. Not in a decorative sense, but in a functional one. Everything was arranged with a logic that was immediately legible. The desks were positioned to catch maximum morning light through the east windows. The bookshelves were labeled. There was a display of geological samples along the window sill, sandstone and feldspar, and something dark he didn't recognize, labeled in small, precise handwriting. The map on the wall had additional notations in pencil, wagon routes, and territorial boundaries, and he noticed the location of every town within a 200-mile radius. "You added to the map," he said. She looked up from the books. It was from 1882 and missing several things that are relevant to children who live here. She went back to her counting. "Those notations are yours. I spent the first 2 weeks reading everything available about this region. The surveyor's office was very helpful." She finished her count, confirmed the number matched, and looked up with genuine satisfaction. "All 48. The publisher sent the complete order. That never happens." She looked at him with a directness that he was becoming accustomed to, which was to say that he was finding it harder to look away from rather than easier. "Thank you for bringing them. Frank said you needed them before the end of the month. I need to review the pedagogy before school starts," she said. "These use a method I haven't taught with before. I want 6 weeks with them. 6 weeks to prepare for arithmetic. To understand how the method works well enough to teach it properly, yes," she said, with a patience that was not condescension, but was very definitely clarity, the kind of patience that a teacher uses when she expects you to think about what she said. "There's a considerable difference between knowing how to do arithmetic and knowing how to teach it so that 22 different children with 22 different ways of understanding can all reach the same outcome. He thought about that for a moment. "I suppose there is," he said. She looked at him with an expression he was only beginning to learn to read, which was the expression she wore when she was revising her assessment of something in a positive direction, but was not going to announce this fact. "Would you like to sit down?" she asked. "I have coffee. It will be terrible coffee because the stove in the house is performing poorly and I haven't managed to regulate it yet, but it will be hot." "I've drunk worse coffee," Monroe said, which was true, and sat down in the chair that she indicated, which was her desk chair and thus the only adult-sized piece of furniture in the room aside from her own. She disappeared through the adjoining door to the house and came back with 2 tin cups, and she sat on the edge of the nearest student desk, with a naturalness that suggested she was not the kind of woman who required a formal arrangement to feel at ease, and they drank the terrible coffee in the afternoon heat and talked. He found out that she was from St. Louis originally, third of 4 children. Father was a bookkeeper who had believed in education for all his children, including the daughters, with a conviction that was apparently considered eccentric by their neighbors. She had trained at the normal school for 2 years and taught for 1 year in a school outside St. Louis before applying for the Western placement, motivated by, she said with a precision that suggested she had thought about how to explain this, the specific desire to be somewhere the work was genuinely needed. She found out that he had come west from Texas 16 years ago with his father's small stake, and a determination to make something of it that had cost him, he said without self-pity, most of a decade of work so relentless it left room for very little else. The ranch was what he had built, and it was something he was genuinely proud of, not in a prideful way but in the way of a man who knows the specific weight of every stone in a wall he has built himself, and therefore cannot look at it without a kind of deep satisfaction. "Do you have children?" she asked. "No," he said, and didn't elaborate. She didn't press. "I imagine the men on the ranch could use schooling," she said instead, which was the turn of a woman who hears an edge in a topic and navigates around it skillfully. "A lot of ranch hands are young and poorly educated." "Some of them," he said. "Pete reads well. A few of the others could benefit from it." "I'll be teaching adults in the evenings eventually," she said. "The school board hasn't agreed to fund it yet, but they will." She said it with the certainty of someone who has already composed the argument and is simply waiting for the right meeting to deliver it. He looked at her and felt something shift in the region he had been avoiding thinking about since the saloon, something specific and ungainly, a recognition that had the quality of something that had been sitting very still for a long time and was beginning, cautiously, to move. "You're going to change things in this town," he said. "I'm going to teach in this town," she said. "What changes, changes." He left 20 minutes later, went back to Pete and the wagon and the business of the day, and said nothing at all on the way back to the ranch. And Pete had the wisdom, this time, to say nothing either. August arrived, and with it, a subtle but definite shift in the shape of Monroe Wallace's weeks. He found reasons to come to town that were not always as logistically necessary as he presented them to Pete, who noticed this and said nothing, which was its own form of support. He found reasons to stop by the schoolhouse, which he managed with a restraint that was partly natural and partly deliberate, because he was experienced enough with himself to know that he was managing an impulse that needed management, and respectful enough of Alice Fletcher to understand that appearing at her door every 3 days would be an imposition rather than a courtesy. He came twice in the first 2 weeks of August. The first time was to let her know that the school board's meeting about adult evening classes had been moved from Tuesday to Thursday, which was information he had happened to overhear at the registry office, and which was genuinely useful to her. The second time was less officially motivated, which he admitted to himself somewhere on the ride into town, and which he addressed by bringing a proper pretext in the form of a copy of the New Mexico Territorial Land Survey that he'd had in his office for years, and which contained detailed geological and geographical information that she might find useful for her map and classroom collection. She accepted both visits with the same quality of attention that she gave everything, which was complete and specific. And she had looked at the land survey for approximately 30 seconds before asking 3 questions about the Pecos River tributary system that suggested she had been reading about the region's hydrology in her spare time, which she had, because she was Alice Fletcher and her spare time was apparently educational. They talked for 90 minutes on that second visit, which was longer than either of them had officially intended. And at the end of it, she had made fresh coffee in the house, and they had moved from the classroom to her small sitting room, which was as organized as the school but had the additional quality of being personal, with her books stacked on a side table, and a letter she'd been writing folded on the desk, and a small watercolor painting of the Mississippi she'd made herself hung on the wall above the fireplace. And Monroe had looked at the painting and felt the particular ache of a thing being beautiful. "You painted that?" he asked. "When I was 18, she said. "I wasn't very good. I'm better now, but I don't have much time for it." "I think it's good," he said. She looked at him for the kind of moment that has weight. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in the specific way of a person receiving a genuine compliment rather than a courteous one. He rode home that evening in the blue-purple dusk of the New Mexico desert, and looked at the sky and thought about the fact that he was 34 years old and had been feeling, for 7 years, like a man who had already made his choices and was simply executing them, and that something was happening that did not fit that model, and that he was not, he discovered, unhappy about this. Clyde Barton was not done. This was perhaps predictable, given that Barton's entire identity was organized around being the person who knew the most and told the most, and Alice Fletcher's mysterious invulnerability to his usual tactics, combined with Monroe Wallace's very public defense of her, had created in him the specific resentment of a man whose professional tool has been declared insufficient. He had a new angle. He had made inquiries, the specific inquiries available to a man with time and connections, and a natural aptitude for nosiness, and he had learned that Alice Fletcher had come from St. Louis and that she had taught briefly in a school outside the city, and that there was, allegedly, a reason she had left that position that was not simply the desire for challenging frontier work. He told this story to Mrs. Patterson at the dry goods store on a Tuesday in mid-August, and he told it with the particular pleasure of a man who has been holding a card and has finally decided to play it. The story, as he told it, involved a scandal, which was a word with tremendous power in 1884 in a small New Mexico town, and while the specific details were vague, which vagueness Barton had learned to use rather than resolve because it allowed every listener to fill in the worst version they could imagine, the suggestion was clear. Alice Fletcher had not left St. Louis entirely on principle. The story made its circuit. Monroe heard it Thursday morning, from Pete of all people, who had heard it from one of the ranch hands who had been in town for supplies, and who reported it with the careful neutrality of someone who is delivering intelligence and explicitly not offering an opinion. Monroe listened to the account and felt the same thing he had felt in the saloon, the tight pull in his chest, but this time it was accompanied by something colder and more deliberate, which was anger of the considered rather than the immediate variety. He did not go directly to Barton. He went first to the post office and sent a telegram to a contact in St. Louis, a cattle buyer named Thomas Riley who had extensive knowledge of that city's social landscape and who owed Monroe a favor from a business deal the previous year. The telegram asked for information, specifically and factually, about the circumstances of Alice Fletcher's departure from her teaching post. Then he went to Alice. He found her at the schoolhouse, where she was reviewing a stack of student enrollment forms that the school board secretary had delivered the previous day, and she looked up when he came to the door with an expression that shifted almost immediately from welcome to assessment, because she had the particular sensitivity of a woman who has learned to read the atmospherics of a room, and she could see that something was different about the quality of his arrival. "You've heard," she said. It was not a question. "I've heard what Barton is saying," he said. "I wanted to hear from you." She put the enrollment forms down and folded her hands on top of them and looked at him very directly. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "The reason I left the school outside St. Louis," she said without preamble and without defensiveness, "was that the school board chairman's son was one of my students, and when I gave him a failing mark on an examination because he had failed the examination, the chairman informed me that my grading standards were excessive, and that if I wished to maintain my position I should reconsider." She paused. "I did not reconsider." Monroe looked at her. "I was dismissed at the end of the school year," she continued, "which is what Clyde Barton has presumably discovered. What he has presumably not made clear is the reason, because the reason involves a member of a respected St. Louis family, and that is less interesting to gossip than a mysterious scandal." "It is, in fact, less interesting to gossip," Monroe said. He felt something that was not quite amusement and was not quite admiration but was made of both of them. "You got fired for being honest." "I got fired for insisting that a 15-year-old boy who did not pass his examination be told so," Alice said, "which is approximately the same thing." She looked at him steadily. "Does that answer your question?" "It answers the question I had," Monroe said. "I sent a telegram to someone in St. Louis this morning to find out the facts." She held his gaze for a moment. "You investigated me before I came here," he said. "I wanted the facts before I made up my mind." Something moved across her face that was complex and quick, and he could not parse all of it, but it did not look like offense. It looked more like someone carefully identifying what they are actually feeling. "Most people," she said after a moment, "would simply decide what they believed without the facts." "Most people," Monroe said, "are wrong about things they could have been right about." That was the moment. Neither of them was going to announce it as such, and it would not become clear as a moment for some time, but it was the moment when something between them became something else, when the particular current of attention and respect and the beginnings of something warmer resolved into a recognition of mutual territory. Alice looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Would you like to stay for lunch? I have ham and bread, and the coffee today is considerably better because I've figured out the stove." "I would," Monroe said. The telegram response from Thomas Riley arrived the following Monday, confirming Alice's account in every particular, and adding that the school board chairman in question had a local reputation for exactly this kind of arrangement, and that Alice Fletcher was considered, by those who knew the situation, to have acted with considerable integrity at considerable cost. Monroe showed the telegram to Judge Harlan, who was on the school board and who needed to know this, and Judge Harlan read it carefully and set it down and said, "I intend to speak to Mr. Barton." "That," Monroe said, "is a conversation I'd like to have been present for." "I imagine you would," Harlan said, with the carefully contained expression of a man who has observed the last 2 months of developments with the professional detachment of someone who is also a human being with opinions. "She's remarkable, you know." "I know," Monroe said, and the lack of qualification in his voice was its own kind of statement. Harlan told Barton privately, and with the specific authority of a man who controlled certain key aspects of local commerce and social standing, that his story about the schoolteacher was not only wrong in its implication, but demonstrably incorrect in its substance, and that if it continued to circulate, the school board would be compelled to formalize their response in ways that would be uncomfortable. Barton, who was a coward at the level where it actually mattered, modified his story immediately into something essentially neutral and then, gradually, allowed it to simply stop existing. Alice knew what Monroe had done. The facts were not hidden. This was a small town, and Mrs. Hobbs, who was genuinely on Alice's side in all things, made sure she understood the full sequence of events. Alice sat with this information for a full day before she did anything with it, which was her custom when dealing with things that mattered, and at the end of that day she walked to the land registry office where Monroe was conducting business and waited outside until he came out and said when he appeared, "I owe you a dinner." He looked at her. "You don't owe me anything." "I know," she said. "That's what makes it a gift rather than a debt. Come to dinner on Saturday. Bring yourself and bring an appetite because I cook better than the coffee situation at the start of the summer may have suggested." "Saturday," he said. 6 o'clock, she said. "Knock. I'll be ready." And she turned and went back to her schoolhouse with her characteristic decisive stride, and Monroe Wallace stood outside the land registry office in the August heat and felt, for the first time in 7 years, like a man who had something to look forward to. She did cook better than the coffee situation had suggested. She cooked considerably better. She had a pot roast that she had been preparing since morning, with root vegetables from the garden of Mrs. Hobbs, who had offered them with transparent enthusiasm when Alice mentioned expecting company, and corn bread made from scratch, and an apple pie from the orchard on the edge of town, whose owner had told her she could pick what she needed in exchange for tutoring his son in reading over the summer, which she had been doing every other Tuesday. Monroe arrived at 6 with his hat in his hand, and a bottle of decent wine he had procured from the general store's limited selection, which Frank Dutton had wrapped with the energy of a man participating in something he considered historically significant. And he knocked, and she opened the door, and she was wearing a dress he hadn't seen before, a deep blue cotton that was practical and clean, and suited her in the way that clothes suit people who have worn them rather than performed them. They sat at her small table in the lamplight and ate and talked, and the talking was of the kind that happens when two people are past the careful introductory stage and have arrived at the territory where real things are discussable. He told her about his father, about Texas, about the specific series of decisions and risks that had produced the Wallace Ranch from a small piece of money and a very large amount of work. She told him about her students in St. Louis, about the children who had learned to read in her classroom the previous year, about a boy named Samuel who had come in barely able to form his letters and had by December been working his way through a geography book with a focus that she described as almost ferocious. "What happened to him?" Monroe asked. "Samuel. He's still at the school, presumably with whoever replaced me." She was quiet for a moment. That was the hardest part, the children. Not the other part, the injustice of it. The dismissal. He didn't say those words directly, but she heard them in the question. "The other part made me angry," she said. "Angry is useful. Missing the children just hurts." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, and something in him that had been very quiet for a long time said something very clearly, and he let himself hear it. "Do you regret coming here?" he asked. She looked at him with full attention, the kind that did not deflect or qualify. "No," she said. "Not at all." September brought the children, all 22 of them, and Alice Fletcher was ready. The first day of school in Rattlesnake Ridge was an event in the community because it had been 2 years since the school had a proper teacher, and because the stories of Alice's preparation had circulated thoroughly enough that most parents had an expectation to match against reality. The reality, by general consensus, exceeded the expectation. Alice ran her classroom with a structured warmth that made it clear simultaneously that this was a serious place and a safe one, that work was expected and respected, and that each child who came through the door was a person she was genuinely interested in. The Hargrove boys, who were famous throughout the town's educational history for the havoc they had wreaked on previous teachers, lasted 4 days before they were won over, which they were not by strictness or by leniency, but by the somewhat unexpected discovery that the schoolteacher found their particular brand of ingenuity interesting and was inclined to redirect it rather than stamp it out. By the end of the first week, the older Hargrove boy was her most enthusiastic student of geography. Monroe came to town twice in September, and both times found reasons to stop by the schoolhouse, and both times Alice had 20 minutes to spare after school when the last student had left, and those 20 minutes expanded naturally into 30 and then 40, and the conversations that happened in them were becoming the thing he organized the day around, which was information about himself he was prepared to accept. He brought her things, not as courtship gifts exactly, though they were that too, but things that had practical use, things he encountered that fit the specific shape of her interests as he understood them. A geological survey from the eastern edge of his land that included rock formations she hadn't seen. A book he'd ordered from a bookseller in Santa Fe that was a survey of New Mexico territorial history. A set of colored chalk in a tin that he had gone considerably out of his way to procure and which produced, when she opened it, an expression of pure delight that was so unguarded and genuine that he had to look away for a moment because the feeling it produced in him was too large to look at directly. "Where did you find colored chalk?" she demanded. "Albuquerque," he said. She looked at him. "Albuquerque is 40 miles away." 42, he said. She held the tin of chalk and looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her deciding what this meant and deciding what to do with what it meant, and the decision she arrived at was this. She reached out and put her hand on his forearm briefly, the lightest touch, and said, "Thank you, Monroe," and it was the first time she had used his first name. "You're welcome, Alice," he said, and they both heard it, the name, his voice, the specific sound of the natural thing. October was the color of copper and gold, and the particular blue of a high desert sky that you only see after the heat of summer has broken. And Monroe Wallace rode into town on a Saturday morning, with the intention of asking Alice Fletcher to go for a ride with him if she had time, which was a departure from the previous pattern in that it was explicitly social rather than superficially practical. And he had spent approximately 2 days deciding whether to do it before concluding that the arithmetic of his own hesitation no longer added up to any sensible total. She was grading papers when he arrived, which he could see through the schoolhouse window, and she came to the door with a pen still in her hand and looked at him with the expression that said she knew something was different about this particular visit. "I thought," he said, and then said the rest of it plainly because he had learned that plainness was what this woman respected. "If you're not occupied this afternoon, I'd like to show you something. On the land. There's a section of the ranch I think you'd find interesting geologically, and the view from the high ground is something you should see." She considered him. "I have 20 more papers to grade," she said. "I'll wait," he said. She held the door open. "Then come in and don't distract me." He came in and sat in the corner with the geological survey and read it while she graded papers, and the specific quality of that hour, the two of them in the same room with their respective work, was so domestic and comfortable that it was almost alarming, and Monroe looked up at one point and caught her looking at him, and she looked back at her papers without hurry, and he looked back at his survey. They rode out at 1:30, on horses from the livery because she could ride, which she had mentioned once as a fact and which he had filed away, and she could ride well, which he discovered in the first 5 minutes and which pleased him in the way that competence always pleased him in people. He took her to the eastern escarpment of the Wallace land, a section of raised ground that looked out over the entire valley, the town below them small and specific in its grid of streets, the cattle land spreading in every direction, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in the northeast turning purple in the afternoon light, and the sky above all of it, the enormous, uncomplicated blue of the high desert. Alice sat her horse on the ridge and looked at all of it and said nothing for a full minute, which was a rare thing for her, and Monroe sat his horse beside her and watched her seeing it. "I understand," she said finally, "why people come out here and don't go back." "Do you?" he asked. She looked at him sideways. "Don't push it," she said, but she was smiling, and it was the particular smile that was not performance but was simply what her face did when she was happy, and he looked at that smile in the high desert light and felt what he felt and did not try to make it smaller. He showed her the geological formations on the escarpment, the exposed strata of sandstone and limestone, the evidence of an ancient seabed and the fossil traces he'd found years ago and never told anyone about because there was no one he had wanted to tell. And she looked at them with the specific intensity of someone storing information accurately, touching the stone with careful fingers, asking questions about depth and position, and what he knew of the region's geological history. And then they sat on a flat rock at the edge of the escarpment in the October sun, with their horses ground-tied below, and talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing, about her students and his cattle and the territory and the country, and what it meant to have made a life in a specific place by the specific choices that had led there. And when the sun began to angle toward the mountains and the air turned cool with the particular edge of a desert evening, neither of them moved immediately. "I want to tell you something," Monroe said. "All right," she said. "I haven't talked to anyone the way I talk to you," he said. "In a very long time." He paused. "I'm not sure I ever have." She looked at him with the full attention she gave everything. "I know," she said, not in a way that was presumptuous, but in a way that said she had felt the same thing and had been waiting for one of them to say it plainly. "Alice," he said. "Monroe," she said. He reached out and she reached out, and their hands met on the flat rock between them, and they sat like that in the cooling afternoon with the valley spread below them, and the mountains turning rose and gold in the evening light. And it was the most important moment either of them had had in years, and they both knew it, and neither of them needed to say so. He asked her formally if he could court her on the ride back, which she accepted with a gravity and a warmth that said she understood what the formality meant, that it was not convention for convention's sake, but respect for the weight of what they were beginning. November brought cold mornings and the school into its routine, and Monroe Wallace into a different relationship with his own life than he had expected to have. He came to dinner on Wednesday evenings, which became the standing arrangement without either of them quite announcing it as such. He walked with her on Sunday afternoons when her grading was done. They attended a church social together in early November, which produced the collective reaction in Rattlesnake Ridge of a long-overdue confirmation of something that everyone had seen coming and been waiting for, with an anticipation that the town expressed by being collectively, aggressively pleased about it. Mrs. Hobbs made a point of standing near Alice at the social and saying to everyone who came within earshot, "Isn't it lovely about Alice and Monroe?" With the satisfaction of someone who has been correct about something for 4 months. Clyde Barton, at the same social, said nothing about Alice Fletcher at all, which was its own significant achievement. The evening classes for adults that Alice had proposed in August came through in November, the school board having been worked on with the patient, documented persistence that Alice brought to all bureaucratic obstacles, and Monroe arranged for 3 of his younger ranch hands, including a 19-year-old named Cal who had taught himself to read from a Bible and had a hunger for books that Alice immediately recognized and fostered, to attend on Tuesday evenings. Cal was going to be fine, Alice told Monroe after the 3rd class with the specific certainty of someone who can see a capacity developing. He understood things on the first explanation. He read ahead. He came with questions. Monroe listened to her talk about Cal with the feeling that was by now familiar and large and no longer frightening, the feeling of watching someone doing the thing they were made to do and being in the particular position of being close enough to see it. December came with cold that was genuine and sharp, and Alice decorated the schoolhouse for Christmas with what she had available, which was considerable given that she had been collecting pine cones and dried flowers and lengths of ribbon, with the systematic preparation she brought to all projects. And the children's last week before the holiday break was a production of holiday songs and a reading program that brought every parent in town to the schoolhouse on the last Friday afternoon, and which was, by any measure, a success. Monroe stood at the back of the room with Pete Dawson, who had come to see his niece perform, and watched Alice in the front of the room conducting 22 children through their program with the focused joy of a woman in her element. And Pete, who had been waiting for approximately 5 months for Monroe to say something specific and definitive, said very quietly, "You're going to marry that woman." Monroe said, equally quietly, "I know." Pete nodded. "When?" "When the time is right." "Monroe," Pete said, "how many years of your life have you spent waiting for the time to be right?" Monroe looked at him. He looked at Alice. He thought about 7 years of a calcified life and the specific warmth of the last 5 months, and the way a flat rock on a desert escarpment in October had been the most important piece of geography he had stood on since the day he claimed this land. "I'll speak to her at Christmas," he said. "Good," Pete said, with the simplicity of a man who has been correct about something for 5 months. He asked her on the day before Christmas, not with the formality of a public event, but with the naturalness of the thing itself. He came to her house in the evening with the bottle of good wine that had become their ritual, and a small box he had ordered from a jeweler in Santa Fe 2 months previously, before he had entirely admitted to himself what it meant that he was ordering it. They had been sitting at her table after dinner, the lamp warm between them, the cold outside making the interior feel more particular and close, and he had been listening to her talk about her plans for the spring term, new units in natural science and a reading competition she was developing, and he had thought, this is the thing. This specific thing, sitting in lamplight and listening to this woman's mind working and knowing that there is nowhere else you want to be. This is what you missed and didn't know you were missing. "Alice," he said. She heard the register change. She looked at him and set down her cup. He said it plainly because that was what she deserved and what he was, a plain man making a plain statement. "I love you. I have been in love with you since approximately the second time I came to this schoolhouse, which I would have admitted sooner if I had been faster at understanding things that matter. I want to marry you if you'll have me, and I want to build a life with you that has room for everything you are and everything you want to do, and I will not ask you to be smaller than you are for any reason." She looked at him for a long time in the lamplight. "That's the most specific proposal I have ever heard described or imagined," she said. "I've been thinking about it for a while," he said. "Monroe," she said, and her voice was something he had never heard from her before, which was simply open, all the efficiency and competence set aside for a moment in favor of the pure feeling underneath it. "I love you too. I've been loving you since a Saturday afternoon on an escarpment in October and being very careful about it because I know who I am and I knew what I was risking and I was right to be careful, and now I'm telling you because you asked plainly and you deserve a plain answer." She said yes. She had said it in the middle of that, but she said it again, directly. "Yes, I will marry you." He put the ring on her finger, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone that the jeweler in Santa Fe had set at Monroe's specific request, because he had thought of Alice looking at the geological samples on the windowsill of her classroom, and had known, somehow, that she would love a stone that came from the ground of this territory, from the specific earth of the place she had chosen. She looked at it on her hand for a long moment. Then she looked at him, and there was in her face the unguarded joy that he had first seen when she opened the tin of colored chalk, but larger, and she came around the table and he stood, and she put her arms around him, and he put his around her, and they stood in the lamplight on the last night before Christmas in Rattlesnake Ridge, New Mexico Territory, 1884, and held each other. They were married in March of 1885, in the church where they had attended the social together in November, and Rattlesnake Ridge turned out with the collective enthusiasm of a community celebrating its own best instincts. Mrs. Hobbs cried from the second row. Pete Dawson stood as Monroe's witness with the expression of a man who has been waiting for this outcome since approximately July and is deeply satisfied with the elapsed time. Judge Harlan officiated with a dignity and warmth that managed to honor both the legal and the personal significance of the occasion. Alice wore a dress of ivory cotton with blue embroidered trim that she had made herself over the winter months with the same focused intention she brought to everything, and she walked down the aisle of the church with her head up and her eyes on Monroe Wallace, who was standing at the altar looking at her with an expression that Pete Dawson would later describe to his wife as the first time in 12 years he had seen that man look entirely like himself. Monroe said his vows in a clear, firm voice that filled the church without difficulty, and Alice said hers in a voice that was equally clear and considerably more controlled than she had expected, because she had thought she might cry, and had decided she would not and had been right, which was typical of her. Clyde Barton attended the wedding because small-town social calculus made his absence more conspicuous than his presence, and he sat in the back, and behaved himself and afterward ate a generous portion of the wedding cake that Mrs. Hobbs and the other women of the church auxiliary had produced, which was a very good cake, and he said to no one in particular, Alice Wallace, correctly and without hesitation, which was perhaps the most honest thing he had managed in recent memory. Alice heard about this later and said good and meant it. She bore no particular grudge. The situation had resolved. She had larger things to attend to. The Wallace Ranch in the spring of 1885 was something Monroe had built for himself, and it became, in the months after the wedding, something he had built for two people, which required some modifications that went deeper than the physical ones. Alice came to the ranch with her books and her geological samples and her watercolor painting of the Mississippi, and she arranged the house with a brisk efficiency that Monroe watched with something between amusement and awe, because in the space of 3 days the ranch house had become what it had not been in the 7 years he had lived in it, which was alive. She kept teaching. This was not a question. Monroe had not proposed with any expectation that she would stop, and she had not agreed with any intention of doing so. And when she returned to school in the fall of 1885 as Alice Wallace, the school board had the good sense to say nothing about the married surname and the position, and how they might or might not interact, because Judge Harlan had preemptively and clearly established that Mrs. Wallace was their teacher, that she was excellent at it, and that the board's interest was served by keeping her happy rather than complicated. Monroe adjusted his Wednesdays. The evening that had been his dinner at the schoolhouse became his evening in his own kitchen, which was now a kitchen where a woman cooked, and where there was a pot on the stove, and the sound of her moving around, and the lamp on the table, and the feeling, every single time, of being in the right place. He also attended the adult evening classes, which surprised Alice enough that she stopped midway through taking attendance the first Tuesday he appeared. "I thought I might benefit from a formal review of my history," he said, with the straight-faced delivery that she had by now learned to recognize as his version of humor. "Sit down, Mr. Wallace," she said, in the voice she used for the classroom, and he sat down and learned things and watched her teach, and she caught him watching twice and looked back at him steadily both times. And Cal, the young ranch hand who had been coming for 2 months, glanced between them with the perceptiveness of a 19-year-old who has understood something without having the vocabulary for it yet, and went back to his book with a small smile. Cal, as Alice had predicted with her characteristic accuracy, was exceptional. By December he could read any text she put in front of him without difficulty, and had developed a specific interest in law, which Alice fostered by acquiring every legal text available through the Santa Fe bookseller, and by having 2 conversations with Judge Harlan about the young man's future that resulted in Harlan agreeing to take Cal on as a reader in his office. This was not a minor thing. For a young man from a ranch crew in the New Mexico Territory in 1885, it was the opening of a door that did not regularly open, and both Monroe and Alice understood what it meant and were glad of it together, which was one of the specific and irreplaceable pleasures of the life they were building. In the spring of 1886, Alice told Monroe she was pregnant, which she did in the manner consistent with her character, which was directly, and at a moment when both of them were present and there was no possible misunderstanding. She told him on a Sunday morning in the kitchen over breakfast, setting down her coffee and looking at him and saying, "I'm going to have a baby. I believe in June." Monroe put down his own cup. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that was not one thing but several things at once, all of them in the direction of more than he had words for. He got up from the chair and came around the table and crouched down next to her chair so they were at eye level and took her hands in both of his and said, "Alice." "I know," she said. "Are you well?" he asked. "Practically first." That was Monroe. "I'm very well," she said. "I have read everything available on the subject. Dr. Pierce agrees that I am healthy and that the pregnancy is progressing normally." "You've already seen the doctor." "I wanted to be sure before I told you," she said. "I don't believe in delivering unnecessary uncertainty." He laughed, which was not what she had expected, and it was a full laugh, one of the ones that changed his whole face, and she felt such an enormous wave of love for this man who laughed at her precision rather than being put off by it that she had to blink. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. "I love you too. Now sit down, your eggs are getting cold." The baby came in late June, a boy, which Monroe announced to Pete with a composure that lasted approximately 30 seconds before something in his face simply gave way, and Pete clapped him on the shoulder and said nothing because nothing was needed. They named him James William Wallace, James for Alice's father and William for Monroe's, and from his first hours he was a substantial and opinionated infant who, Alice observed with considerable satisfaction, was clearly going to be a person of strong convictions. Monroe held him that first evening with the particular reverence of a man who has not expected to hold such a thing again, and is being very careful with the gift. And James looked up at his father with the unfocused intensity of the newborn, and Monroe looked back at him, and the room was very quiet. Alice watched them from the bed and felt the fullness of it settle in her chest like something that had been looking for its place for a very long time. Rattlesnake Ridge continued. The town grew. The railroad junction 12 miles south expanded and brought more trade and more people, and the particular dynamism of a frontier community finding its shape. Alice taught through the fall of 1886 until the evident fact of the pregnancy made it impractical, and she arranged for a temporary teacher from Albuquerque to manage the spring term while James was born, and she returned in the fall of 1886 with James in a basket in the corner of the schoolhouse until he was old enough for Mrs. Hobbs to watch him during school hours, which Mrs. Hobbs considered one of the finest arrangements of her adult life. The school grew with the town. By 1887, she had 29 students, and the school board was discussing an additional classroom, and Alice had submitted a detailed proposal for a second teacher and a structured 2-room curriculum that the board was treating with the cautious enthusiasm of people who can see the logic but are nervous about the cost. Monroe, at the school board meeting in question, which he attended for the first time in his life, said, "The ranch will fund the additional teacher's first 6 months. The town can take it from there." This announcement produced a silence and then a rapid reorganization of the board's position that resulted in the second room being approved. Alice, afterward, looked at him with the expression that said she was revising her assessment of something in a deeply positive direction, and she said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She kissed him in the middle of the main street of Rattlesnake Ridge at 11 in the morning, which was a thing that Mrs. Hobbs witnessed from the door of the dry goods store, and subsequently described to her husband as the most romantic thing she had seen in 30 years of marriage. Cal, by 1888, had passed his bar examination in Santa Fe, which was a remarkable achievement for a young man of 22 who had learned to read properly at 19, and which Judge Harlan announced publicly with the specific pride of someone who has seen a person become who they were going to be. Monroe and Alice attended the celebration dinner that Harlan organized, and Alice told Cal that she had never been more pleased with the result of anything she had done in a classroom, and Cal, who had grown into a measured and serious young man, looked at her and said, "You saw it before I did," which was not a small thing to say and not a small thing to be true. Clyde Barton, it should be noted, had changed. People do sometimes change, especially when they are confronted with consistent evidence that the behavior they have built their identity around causes harm and earns contempt, rather than the admiration they have mistaken for the same thing. He had not become a different person entirely. He was still curious and sociable, and he still knew everything that happened in Rattlesnake Ridge. But he had acquired, sometime in the years following the saloon incident and the telegram and Judge Harlan's quiet conversation, a selectivity about what he did with what he knew. He still talked. He simply talked less about things that could hurt people and more about things that were simply interesting, and this was, in the small economy of a person's character, genuine progress. He had never directly apologized to Alice Fletcher, which was Alice Wallace now. He was not quite capable of it. But he had said her name correctly, every time, for 3 years, and he had spoken of the school and its teacher with a consistent and genuine respect that was its own kind of acknowledgement. And Alice, who was not a woman who needed people to perform penance, accepted this as sufficient. In 1889, New Mexico was moving toward eventual statehood, and the territory was changing in ways that Monroe watched with the interest of a man who has built something in a place and cares what becomes of it. The cattle trade was evolving, the railroad was reorganizing the economics of ranching, and some of the older ranchers who had built on open range were finding the new fencing era harder to adapt to than Monroe, who had planned for it. He talked about this with Alice in the evenings with the same openness he brought to everything they discussed, which was complete, and she listened with the specific quality of attention she had always given him and said things that were useful, not because she understood the cattle business in its technical particulars, but because she understood reasoning and information and the systematic approach to problems. And sometimes the most useful thing in a complicated situation is a mind that is excellent at thinking rather than already full of existing conclusions. They were, by this point, something that the people who watched them most carefully, Mrs. Hobbs, Judge Harlan, Pete Dawson, found themselves using as a reference point for what a good partnership looked like. Not because they were without friction, which they were not. Alice had opinions and Monroe had opinions, and sometimes these occupied the same territory and required negotiation, which they did, occasionally loudly, always honestly, and always to a resolution that both of them could stand on. But the negotiation itself was built on a foundation that held because it was built of actual things, respect and honesty, and the specific willingness to prioritize the relationship over being right. James Wallace, 3 years old in 1889, was a child of such focused intelligence that his mother observed him with the professional appreciation of a teacher and the somewhat awed recognition of a parent. He talked in complete sentences and asked questions continuously, and had recently developed a passionate interest in the horses on the ranch that Monroe was nurturing with the deliberate patience of a man who knows exactly what it means to love a piece of land and the life it carries. In the fall of 1889, Alice told Monroe she was pregnant again. "I know," he said, which was her word, and she laughed, which was a sound he organized a significant portion of his existence around producing. The second baby arrived in April of 1890, a girl this time, and they named her Clara, which was a name that had history for Monroe that Alice knew, and she had suggested it herself, which Monroe had received with the specific gratitude of someone who understands what a gift of forgiveness looks like. Clara Wallace was, from her first hours, her mother's specific form of organized chaos, loudly opinionated and physically energetic, and possessed of a smile that arrived with the suddenness and completeness of sunrise. The school in Rattlesnake Ridge was, by 1890, something that Alice had built into a genuine institution. The two-room arrangement was working well. The second teacher, a young woman named Miss Park who had come from Albuquerque, and who Alice was training with the systematic care she brought to everything she valued, was excellent, and the adult evening classes had produced 5 graduates who had gone on to specific and documented improvements in their circumstances. Alice was writing a detailed report of the program's outcomes for submission to the Territorial Education Authority, which she intended to use as the basis for an argument for structured funding. Monroe read the draft of this report on a Tuesday evening while James was asleep, and Clara was making the specific sounds of a baby who has not decided whether she intends to sleep or conduct further business. And when he finished, he set it down and looked at his wife, who was feeding Clara by lamplight with the multitasking efficiency of a woman who has adapted her capacities to the demands of her life, and said, "This is going to change how the territory funds rural education." "That's what it's intended to do," she said. "It will work," he said. She looked at him over Clara's head. "I know," she said. He smiled, which was the full one, the one that changed his face. "Don't be smug," she said. "I'm proud," he said. "There's a difference." "A minor one," she said. "No," he said, "not minor at all." She looked at him for a long moment in the lamplight, with Clara settled and the house quiet and James asleep down the hall and the ranch outside with its particular nighttime sounds. And what was in her face was the same thing that had been there since an escarpment in October, since a lamplit table in December, since a March morning in a church, since all the cumulative weight of everything they had chosen together, which was happiness that had been earned in specific and legitimate ways, and therefore had the particular solidity of something that will not easily be taken. The report was submitted in November of 1890 and was taken seriously by the Territorial Authority, which invited Alice to Santa Fe in January of 1891 to present the program in detail to an education committee. Monroe accompanied her on the trip, which was 4 days and constituted the longest they had been away from the ranch together, and they left James with Mrs. Hobbs, who received this responsibility with the energy of someone who has been waiting for precisely this opportunity, and took Clara with them because Clara was still nursing. Santa Fe in January was cold and beautiful and considerably larger than Rattlesnake Ridge, and Alice in front of the education committee was Monroe's favorite thing he had ever seen in his life, which was saying something given that his life had included some landscapes of remarkable beauty. She presented the data clearly, answered questions with the precision that was her characteristic instrument, and made the argument for structured funding with a logic that moved through its sequence like a well-built fence, each point the necessary support for the next. The committee allocated provisional funding for 3 similar programs in other territorial school districts, pending a 1-year review. On the train back from Santa Fe, with Clara asleep across Alice's lap, and the desert dark outside the windows and the lamp in their compartment making a warm circle of light, Monroe took her hand and held it and said nothing, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and said nothing either, and the train moved south through the winter dark toward Rattlesnake Ridge and their life and their boy, who was waiting with Mrs. Hobbs, and the school that was changing things and the ranch that was home. The year 1891 brought changes to Rattlesnake Ridge that were part of the larger movement of the territory. A new post office building was constructed. The main street was regraded. A second general store opened, which Frank Dutton opposed initially and then adapted to with the resilience of a man who has survived many versions of commerce. The school, with its funded evening program, became a point of genuine local pride, and Alice's name was spoken in the context of the town's development in ways that would have astonished Clyde Barton in June of 1884, though they did not astonish him now, because he had been watching long enough to see exactly how it happened. Monroe's ranch continued to be the solid center of his material life, and the thing he spent his days making work, and the years of adaptation to the changing cattle economy had positioned him well. He had moved earlier than most ranchers to the fencing arrangements that the end of open range required, and his relationships with the rail buyers were established and trusted, and the Wallace Ranch had the particular security of something well built on correct foundations. James, at 5, was going to school in his mother's classroom, which was the kind of circumstance that required careful navigation, and which Alice navigated with the professional expertise and the slightly amused practicality of a woman who has thought through every complication in advance. James was not given special treatment. James was given the same rigorous expectation as every other student, and if he occasionally looked up from his desk to find his mother at the front of the room and felt the dual weight of it, the security and the pressure, that was an experience that was building him in directions that Monroe, watching, thought were correct. Clara, at one, was a force of nature in small form. Pete Dawson got married in the spring of 1891 to a widow named Mrs. Ruth Alcott, who had come to town 2 years previously with a general store claim from a deceased husband and a competence in business that Pete had respected and eventually loved. Monroe was his witness, and Alice arranged the wedding lunch with the same organizational ferocity she brought to the school program, and it was an excellent lunch. In the summer of 1892, the Territorial Education Authority sent a representative to Rattlesnake Ridge, specifically to observe Alice's program, which had become something of a model for the 3 funded replications. The representative was a man named Dr. Elias Crane from the University of New Mexico, who arrived with a formal letter of introduction and a degree of condescension that lasted approximately 11 minutes in Alice Wallace's classroom before collapsing entirely under the weight of the evidence. He wrote a report that described the Rattlesnake Ridge program as, quote, among the most effectively structured educational interventions in the territory, and recommended full continued funding and expansion, and cited Mrs. Alice Wallace specifically as the architect of a methodology worth replicating, and this report circulated through the Territorial Authority and eventually reached the desk of the Territorial Governor, who noted it with the approval of a man who knows that a program working well is easier than fixing a problem. Alice received this news on a Wednesday evening when Monroe brought the letter from the post office, and she read it at the kitchen table and then read it again, and then she folded it carefully and put it in the box where she kept important documents, and she looked at Monroe and said, "Good," with the specific satisfaction of someone who has been working toward something for a long time and has arrived. "Good," Monroe said. "Very good," she said. "But now I need to figure out how to use the expansion funding before someone on the committee has a different idea about what to do with it." He laughed. He loved this woman with the specific and unreserved love of a man who has found the person who is actually correct for him and knows it, and is grateful for it every day. James Wallace, in 1893, at 7 years old, was reading at a level that his mother assessed privately as well above his age and publicly as progressing well, which was the grade she would have given any student at his level. He had his father's directness and his mother's precision, and his own particular quality that was neither, which was a way of seeing the social dimensions of any situation that Monroe said was going to make him either a very good businessman or a very good politician, and Alice said those were not necessarily different things. Clara, at 3, was still a force of nature in small form, now a mobile and opinionated one who had attached herself to the horses on the ranch, with a passion that exceeded even James's early interest, and that Monroe fostered with the same deliberate patience he had given James, thinking about a little girl who was going to know this land the way he knew it. In 1893, Monroe and Alice were standing on the escarpment above the valley, the same ridge where he had first brought her in October of 1884, now 9 years ago, and the valley below had changed in visible ways, more buildings, a larger grid, the signs of a town that was becoming something. But the mountains to the northeast were the same, and the sky was the same enormous blue, and the land spread in every direction with the particular beauty of something that does not answer to anyone's opinion of it. They had come up without the children, which Pete and Ruth had made possible with the casual generosity of people who understand what time together means in a life with children and work and responsibilities, and they sat on the same flat rock where they had sat the first time, and Monroe held Alice's hand and looked at the valley. "I have been thinking," Monroe said. "About what?" she asked. "About how I told you, that first time we talked at Frank's store, that you were going to change this town," he said. She looked at him. "You said I was going to change things in this town. And you said you were just going to teach," he said. "I remember," she said. "You were right," he said. "You taught. The changes happened." He looked at her. "I should have been more specific. I should have said, you are going to teach in this town, and everything that needs to change is going to change because you were here." She was quiet for a moment. "Monroe," she said. "Yes," he said. "I should have said," she said carefully, "that none of it happens the way it happened if you don't walk into a saloon in June of 1884 and make it absolutely clear that my name was not available for careless handling." She looked at him with the full attention that he had been the recipient of for 9 years, and that still had the quality of being entirely seen. "That was you. That was the first thing." "I didn't know you then," he said. "You knew something mattered," she said. "You acted on it. That's who you are." He looked at her in the afternoon light on the escarpment above the valley where they had both made their lives, and felt the weight of all of it, the good and the hard and the years and the children and the work and the evenings in lamplight and the arguments and the laughter and the specific irreplaceable fact of being known by this woman. And he said simply, "I love you, Alice." "I love you, Monroe," she said. They sat on the flat rock in the October sun of 1893, above a valley that was different than it had been when they first sat here, above a life that was full in every direction. And the mountains to the northeast were turning the same rose and gold of late afternoon that they had turned 9 years ago. And they stayed until the sun was well toward setting, and then rode back down together in the blue-purple dusk to the ranch where their children were, to the house that was alive, to the specific and precious shape of the existence they had built with their choices and their honesty and the particular stubbornness of two people who had been right about each other from the start. In the years that followed, Rattlesnake Ridge moved toward the 20th century with the peculiar mixture of loss and transformation that all frontiers undergo, the open range closing, the cattle trade evolving, the territory pressing toward statehood. Monroe adapted, as he always had, with the practical intelligence of a man who has never confused what he loves about a place with the specific form it takes at any given moment. Alice taught through all of it, and the school became something that would outlast both of them, which was, she thought, precisely the point. The children who sat in her classroom grew up and built things, and some of them left, and some of them stayed, and all of them carried something from those years that was more than arithmetic or geography, which was the specific experience of being taken seriously in a room where they were given the tools to become who they were going to be. James Wallace grew into a young man of uncommon quality, and at 15 he was reading law, following Cal's path and extending it, with the mentorship of Judge Harlan and the steady expectation of parents who knew exactly what he was capable of. Clara Wallace was, at 11, the most accomplished young writer in the county and the most consistent reader in her mother's class, a combination that her father found entirely satisfying, and her mother considered a reasonable start. Monroe and Alice, on the occasion of their 10th anniversary in March of 1895, were given a dinner by the town that they had not asked for and did not entirely expect, organized by Mrs. Hobbs with the energy of someone executing a project of deep personal meaning, attended by virtually everyone in Rattlesnake Ridge including Judge Harlan, Pete and Ruth Dawson, Frank Dutton, Cal who had ridden up from Santa Fe where he was now practicing law, and yes, Clyde Barton, who sat near the back and ate well and raised his glass when the toasts were made. Judge Harlan spoke. He said that a town was the sum of the choices made in it, and that the town of Rattlesnake Ridge had been made better, in specific and documentable ways, by the two people being honored, and that this was not the usual polite thing said at such occasions, but a statement of fact that he was prepared to defend in any jurisdiction. Monroe spoke briefly, which was appropriate given that he was Monroe, and said that the best decision he had ever made in a life that had required many decisions was the one he had made without knowing he was making it, which was to walk across a saloon in June of 1884, because something in him that was more intelligent than the rest of him understood that the name Alice Fletcher was not something that should be handled carelessly. The room laughed, and the room was warm with it. Alice spoke last, and she said what was true, which was that she had come to Rattlesnake Ridge for the work, and she had stayed for the same reason, and that the life she had built here was more than she had designed because life was like that. It exceeded your plans when your plans were sound enough that the exceeding part had room to grow, and that she was grateful for every specific thing in that room and would be for the rest of her life. Then she looked at Monroe across the table and said, "And I am grateful most specifically for the man who told a gossip to say my name right." The room erupted. Monroe looked at her and shook his head and then smiled. The full one, the one that changed his face, and she smiled back. And they were in their 40s and had been married for a decade and had 2 children and a school and a ranch and a life that had been built with honesty and love and the particular stubbornness of 2 people who knew what they had from the moment they understood it. And there was nothing left unresolved between them, nothing left unsaid that needed saying, no wound that hadn't been tended. No debt uncollected, no question hanging open in the air. Everything had been answered. Everything was well. The story that had begun with a man crossing a saloon floor because someone said a woman's name wrong was a story that had resolved into something so solid and complete that it would stand long after the people who built it were gone, in the children they raised, and the school that continued, and the town that had been changed by the choice to be honest rather than careful, decent rather than convenient, and present for the life that was actually happening rather than the safer one that could have been arranged. Alice Fletcher had come to Rattlesnake Ridge with 2 trunks and a letter of appointment and an unreasonable degree of courage. Alice Wallace looked across a dinner table at her husband and her children and the community she had helped shape, and knew that every bit of it had been worth exactly what it cost, which was considerable, and had paid exactly what it promised, which was more. Monroe Wallace, who had spent 7 years in a calcified life and then spent 10 years in a real one, looked back at his wife across the table and felt the same thing he had felt on a flat rock on a desert escarpment in October of 1884, which was the recognition of something right, something true, something that could be stood on without fear. He had asked her to say her name right. She had said it right every day since, in every room she walked into and every child she taught and every argument she made and every evening she came home, by simply being exactly and completely Alice Wallace, which was the person she had always been and would always be, name and all. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.